Hi, I'm Warren Sprouse. You're on the Bible Forum. We do this every Sunday night from 8 to 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you'd like to join us live, if not, of course, you can do it now. You're on a YouTube and you're paying attention this way. I wanted to share just a few brief issues. I mentioned at the top of the broadcast, in talking to my son-in-law who teaches in a Christian school, teaches 8th grade, ran into an entire class of students who struggle with self-image. And these are children who presumably come from a Christian home. A lot of different levels to that, but it was startling. And in thinking about what it was that might have created this dynamic, I thought about writing a book. It started out as an article, but I realized that as it went along, it couldn't just be that. And the first chapter that I came up with, these chapters probably change, but you got to start somewhere. The first chapter I entitled Christians at Heart, Broken and Hurting. And that's the good guys. That's the Christians. In the days of the prophets of Israel, there was a natural salve native to the area of Gilead. Applied by physicians, this salve, or in the terms of the Hebrew, balm, B-A-L-M, had the ability to heal wounds. It was a much sought-after commodity by many nations round about. In the prophetic word, this balm was likened to the spiritual power flowing from the people of God to an entire world. Jehovah dwelt there in his temple, and all was well. Yet the prophet Jeremiah struggles with the overt sin of God's people. This on the eve of what became the Babylonian captivity. And he asks with all that Israel had and provided for other people and nations, was there no balm in Gilead for them? No physician to apply it? Must the health of the daughter of my people not be recovered? Here's an allusion to a common contemporary problem. Christians carrying the life-giving gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ to a sin-sick world. Men and women who are saved by this gospel. Societies that are changed for the better, uplifted by this gospel. Yet the average American Christian lives the life of a spiritual pauper, struggling with doubts, fears, spiritual weaknesses, and practical hopelessness. With all the gospel brings to others, where is the balm for our soul? Chapter 1 is entitled Christians at Heart, because there is no other kind. There is cultural Christianity, but that's a sham. If you do not have the Spirit of God dwelling in your heart, you're not a Christian. It doesn't matter how many churches you go to, how many prayers you've prayed, or how many Bibles you've read, or how many other people have gotten saved because you've talked to them about Jesus. The modernism of the late 19th and early 20th centuries brought about a new age. We had Darwinism in the mid to late 1800s. We had communism, socialism. We had the psychological community with Freud. Freud was operating at that same time. And we had a New Age hermeneutic. A team of Anglican priests by the name of Westcott and Hort produced a new Greek text for the Bible, initially the New Testament, but ultimately the Bible. These four influences changed us forever. One was social, another was political, one was psychological, and one was spiritual. Every new translation of the Bible has come from these two men, from this new text, which in some circles is referred to as a New Age text. The only exception is the New King James Version of the Bible. It uses the old and the tried and true. But it does use a system of interpretation that isn't literal. It translates it in terms of concept instead of words. And that tends to change some things. By the mid-1920s, these men had changed the face of the world. We were celebrating hedonism, calling it the Roaring Twenties, banning the sale of alcohol to protect women, children, and society in general simply created more lawlessness. Americans were relieved that Germany had been defeated in Europe and Christianity was no longer necessary. America never wanted to go to war again, and they allowed Europe to descend into its own private hell. In the midst of all of this came the Great Depression and another war with Germany. Americans were galvanized in fear around concepts like survival and fear of the unknown. As is common with human beings everywhere, they turned to their God, the one featured in our political and legal documents, the one who got us through the revolution and the war between the states. We didn't necessarily follow his principles, but we did fear his displeasure, and we loved his protection. During this time, we had what were called blue laws, a term to describe religious limitations on what could be sold on Sunday, which some called the Christian Sabbath. Sunday in America was a quiet day, not a day to make money or even noise. America was a Christian nation. Crime was limited to cities and the criminal element. Marriage was sacred and divorce was a shame. Families were larger than they are now, although shrinking as our agrarian society gave way to factories. There was no effective birth control system other than the rhythm method or abstinence. There were abortions. Don't let them tell you there were no abortions before Roe v. Wade. There were abortions performed by doctors when the life of the mother was at stake. Women stayed home while the men worked. This was not just simply traditional, but a reality driven by circumstance. There was rudimentary radio. We called them crystal sets in the 1930s. By the 1940s, we had channels. You could change from one to another. So we had choice. Music was the mainstay of radio. Big band music dominated the airwaves all the way through the 1930s and into the 1940s. These patterns would remain largely unchanged through the 1950s. The culture would give the appearance of Christian values. The facade, however, would be stripped away in the 1960s. Birth control pills would let women go to work. TV would bring the world into our living rooms. The industrial boom of the 1950s and 60s would enrich ordinary households, providing a standard of living never before known by the average worker. Movies would come right into your home on TV, color movies. In the 1960s, we saw the beginning of Monday night at the movies, and it was a big deal. Baby boomers had money, cars, TV, transistor radios, and time. The Christian facade was crumbling. Then came Vietnam. Our society and our security, our future, were all threatened. TV brought that war right into our living rooms every night. We watched the body counts, the body bags, the horrors, the evil, and we saw it in living color. The soldiers and airmen were finding drugs to dampen their fears, new drugs, different drugs, stronger versions of older drugs. Men were coming home hooked on these drugs, traumatized by what they'd seen and experienced. It was a different kind of war. A war against a largely unseen enemy. No uniforms, no front line. Jungle warfare. Warfare where children might be the enemy. It changed an entire generation, both emotionally and spiritually. And their government was part of the problem. Their leadership was not to be trusted. Their God had abandoned them. All they had was their fear and the respite provided by rock music, drugs, and sex. This is what influenced the next generation, the baby busters. A generation with no link to the past, no patterns to ground them, no values to support them, no reason to sacrifice anything they liked or wanted to be or do. The veneer had been pulled completely off, and America stood spiritually and morally naked before the world. The Clinton years validated that culture. He was a president clearly a liar, a fornicator, and a fake, surrounded by operatives bent on creating an artificial reality to protect their leader. The message was not lost on that generation. Old values, godly character, noble integrity didn't matter as much as success. Success in your own chosen field of endeavor. And the most valued field of endeavor was wealth and power, however you got it, whatever that meant. If you could not have wealth and power, you could always look and act as though you did. Alcohol, drugs, cigars, women, sex, music, clothes, cars, vulgar language became the badges of success. The me generation had grown up. The new millennium was ushered in on the wings of fear. We were told all the computers would crash 1 minute after the new year 2000 began. Programmers in the 1980s hadn't accounted for that change. The world would be plunged into darkness and chaos, which it wasn't. The new millennium would also be marked by an undeclared war with Islam. Again. Islam's third effort to conquer the world for Allah had begun with a relatively small incursion. Iraq versus Kuwait. The West's effort to save Kuwait and its oil from destruction incurred the wrath of the Shiite Muslims, the more radical of the Muslims, against the great Satan, America of the West. It would come to our shores on September 11th, 2001. The war continues and will no doubt take us to the brink of the Great Tribulation. Its greatest impact being the mixing of East and West, Jehovah and Allah, Spiritism and spiritualism, a mixing that began in Vietnam between a spiritually protected civilization and a grossly, openly spiritistic civilization. If America had retained her Judeo-Christian values, the moral and social destruction so prevalent today would not exist. The family would still be the basic building block of our society. Immorality would not be popular and prevalent. Our economic situation would be stronger. TV would still have a code of ethic that was enforced. Movies would be clearly and uniformly restricted. I read just this week a movie theater that had taken to restricting 6-year-olds from R-rated movies. Not because they thought the 6-year-old was going to be damaged by it, but because they were too noisy. Cutoff point for R-rated movies used to be 18. Now it's 6. People would not wear play clothes and work clothes, or now they would wear play clothes and work clothes to church. Central music forms would now be the bedrock of our worship. People would never again respect authority in the home or on the street. Voting age adults would be seriously considering a socialist or a misogynist for president. And this book would have no reason to exist. However, since all of these things and more are 21st century realities, here we are. So the question is, now what? Now the heart and soul of America is taken with all things crass and immoral. Authority structures either no longer exist or are figureheads to be balanced when anarchy is exposed. Education is largely a joke, with a federal education system in disarray and liberal arts degrees being largely useless. The economy teeters on the brink of destruction because it is no longer tethered to anything stationary or of value. And these are generally accepted as the rule of thumb in the world's culture. There's no uniform code of morality. Truth is no longer an absolute value. The word family means whatever anybody wants it to mean. Godly character is gone from the society. The leaders and the authorities of our society are not trustworthy nor honest except when it serves their purpose. In short, we are a society adrift, and our little boat is leaking from every seam. Our children grow up accepting slovenliness, immorality, opportunism, and relativity as normal. What do we do when they begin to respond to all this in destructive ways? We give them drugs. They're anxious, they're hyperactive, they're depressed, they're disaffective. They have a mental or personality disorder. They're stressed or angry or fill in the blank. And we have a pill for it. Rarely do we look in the mirror to find a cause for their feelings, their attitudes, or their behaviors. The medicine chest is too readily available. It's the first half of the first chapter. There'll be more to come. This is not going to be a comedy. Hopefully it'll have a practical biblical solution by the time we get to the end of it. You pray for me, and I'll pray for you, and we'll get this done together.